Welcome to It's More Than Grit, the CSIS podcast about the crucial role entrepreneurs play in the global economy. I am Mariana Campero.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz. Join us as we hear stories of both triumphs and setbacks and how economic and policy environments across the globe shape their outcomes.
Let's dive in and learn why being a successful entrepreneur takes more than just grit.
For this episode, we had the pleasure of interviewing Adolfo Babatz, the founder, chairman, and CEO of Clip.
We discussed the challenges of attracting talent and, more importantly, how to improve financial inclusion in Mexico.
It was a fascinating episode, and we learned so much from Adolfo. We hope you do too.
Adolfo, welcome back to CSIS. It's truly a pleasure to have you again. Let me start by taking you back a little bit. You had graduated from MIT. Working in what I assume was a pretty cool job in PayPal, and suddenly decided to jump and to become an entrepreneur in Mexico at a time when apparently the word emprendedor or entrepreneur was not very common.
Yep.
So what drove you to jump and take such a risk?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mariana and CSIS for having me here again. I love coming to your events and the podcast, so I'm super happy to be here. Every entrepreneur that I know has a very personal reason to start something. They're all valid reasons. There's no right or wrong reason. And I think it comes to a very personal thing. Over the years, I have found what drove me to that. But I'll tell you initially what it really drove me. It was the desire to create new products and services. That's what I love doing. At PayPal, I learned how to do that. PayPal was amazing for me because that's a place where I learned how to create and design products and services that users need and want, most importantly. And over the years, Mariana, this is after a lot of self-reflection, this is more personal and tied to childhood and to going back a few years. It has to do with freedom. For me, it was very important to have freedom over my actions, over my decisions, over my future. I grew up in a very strict home. My home was almost military. It was super, super strict. I always did what I was supposed to do. And when I went to MIT, that's the first time I really started opening my eyes to do what I wanted to do. Then I left for PayPal. I started at PayPal when working in tech was not very common or sexy. Investment banking and consulting were the thing there back then.
Right.
Unconsciously, that sense of freedom and wanting to do what I really wanted to do, not what I was supposed to do, is what also led me to start Clip. Now, when I started, I didn't know that, right? I just knew the product part. But those are the two reasons why I decided to start. If you think about it, I don't think it was a rational decision, and I don't think any entrepreneur or most entrepreneurs will tell you they made a rational decision when started something. Maybe we rationalize it later. Oh yeah, it was this big problem and this big opportunity, and I had the skills, and kind of the stars align. If you put it from a pure risk reward perspective, I don't think the math adds up. But that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create new products, new services. I love doing that at PayPal. I knew that I was going to have a lot more freedom if I do something on my own. And that's what I threw myself into it.
Adolfo, you're widely considered to be a pioneer in Latin American business. You were the first to open the road for some small companies, the first payments unicorn. However, as Mario and I have discovered, being the first is easier said than done. What's really kept you going?
So what I like to say, Andrew, is that tech entrepreneurship or high impact entrepreneurship, like they call it in Endeavor, is the Olympics of the people that don't have the skills or the bodies to be Olympic athletes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Or just too old at this point, right?
Exactly. That's
We've aged out
I would
of
say
our
mature, not
athletic
old.
greatness.
Mature.
Yeah.
So I think what keeps you, and I tell this when they invite me to universities to give talks and all that. I'm sure most entrepreneurs agree with this. There's no monetary reward, magazine covers, or things like that will compensate what you will have to go through. I don't think any of us realize what we're going to go through. Most of those us probably wouldn't do it. And I think what keeps you going, and this is why I mentioned on the previous question that Mariana raised, is not the desire only in my case for products and services. In my case, it was a deep, deep childhood-based desire of freedom, and in a second place, kind of equal opportunities or justice, if you want to call it that. There has to be something else, something more profound. In my case, like I mentioned, it was a deep, deep sense of wanting to have freedom. I used to joke with a coach that I had that because she told me, what is the worst thing that can happen? And I said, well, the worst thing that can happen is that I end up in a bank in Mexico, stapling, acquiring paperwork for merchants. All right. That's
like the back office or
yes,
whatever.
yeah, the back, exactly. That would be my no. So for me, it was a deep, deep sense of wanting freedom, and the lack of equal opportunities also played a role when things get very tough. Because as you know, Andrew, and you of course know this, Mariana, Mexico, or Latin America in general, not only Mexico, it's a deeply, deeply unfair and uneven place. And I do believe most of the problems that we have as societies come from that inequality. So those were the two things that really have kept me going throughout all these years, and both are rooted in childhood.
Yeah.
And I think it's the case with most entrepreneurs.
Adolfo, you've talked about the products that PayPal taught you how to build, and also how they taught you to solve problems. In Mexico, you just started to talk a little bit about the Mexican financial system. What problem were you trying to solve, and how did Clip solve the problem?
Yeah, what we solve, it's a really simple problem, Mariana, that has been solved in many other economies around the world, which is help SMBs accept payments. Basically, that's what we do. And we can talk about the ecosystem later, or the industry structure later. But basically, we fill as a company a macroeconomic hole, which is the acceptance of payments for SMBs in the 12th largest economy in the world. That's what Clip does. And the opportunity that we had in front of us when I started the company, and that we still have today, is probably the largest opportunity of this kind in the world. The current industry structure has left a massive hole for us to fill. And that's where the opportunity is, right? For entrepreneurs, when there's friction, when there's problem, that's where entrepreneurs come in and really solve what many people think are unsolvable problems. And in the process, a lot of us fail. And in the process, a lot of us also succeed, or some of us succeed. And I think that's what we have been doing quite successfully at Clip. It's just providing basic payment acceptance and now other financial services and growth services to merchants. We help them run and grow their business.
Adolfo, when you launched Clip, you began with just $1.5 million and a team of only 5 people. It's now grown to be valued at $2 billion. So what were the early days like? What were you doing when you had very little resources and a small team?
I think the early days of a company, Andrew, are very similar to childhood. The good and bad things you learn as a kid, they usually stay with you for most of your life, unless you actually work consciously on improving the good things and removing the bad things. But
A lot
usually,
of therapy.
yes, it usually stays with you. And I think in the case of companies, it's similar. And let me tell you why. So you correctly mentioned we raised $1.5 million. This was 2012. $1.5 million, it's a ton of money. Okay, still today, it's a lot of money. Back then was a scandal what we raised, and it was the first tech round ever raised for a Mexican tech startup, and of course the largest. So still, we compared to today, we had very little money. Okay, so the company grew from 2012 all the way to 2019 with very scarce resources. And I think that taught us a lesson that has come handy in the last couple of years, which is we know how to live with very little. Courage, they can live with very little. There's no way you can kill them. I think companies that start scarce are like that. A company that starts scarce is a company that is very, very, very strong-willed and is very resilient and is very adaptive to change. So with that $1.5 million, even though we spend more than a third on the design of the hardware, because we did the design of the hardware ourselves, we hired some of our first employees, the first engineers, and we started some of our distribution. But the early days of a company are critical. They were critical for Clip. They were critical, especially for me as CEO, because that's when I made, believe it or not, the most mistakes. It was the early days of the life of a company where I made the most basic and the most grave mistakes in the entire 12 years. And those were mistakes around people, around hiring, about firing, and about letting go or keeping people. made every mistake in the book possible. And I think that marked me personally, profoundly, to not make those same mistakes again. Made mistakes, but I do try to learn from them. And I in this particular case, I do think I learned from them. For some people, the early days are the golden years, right? Because it's when you're getting started, when it's new. For me, it was a little bit different. It was hard. I made a lot of mistakes. I learned some good lessons. And I think the culture of the company, doing a lot with very little, it was grounded in those days.
Adolfo, let me ask you about the environment in which you're operating. It is no secret that Latin American economies have been controlled for many years by very few players, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And Mexico in particular, the financial system is controlled by 4 or 5 banks, big players. Mm-hmm. It's basically an oligopoly, right? I mean, they actually have the power to restrict supply, to increase prices. Despite having Mexico having flourishing fintech ecosystem today, still credit card penetration is low. The big banks still control a lot of the market. Why?
Yep. We have to go back, Mariana, I don't want to spend a lot of time, but we have to go back to 1982. You remember, and Andrew, I'm sure, read about it. I'm not sure you were in Mexico at that time, Andrew, but the nationalization of Mexican banks by López Portillo, the president back then. So that created a huge problem for the economy and for the financial system. Then we have the privatization done in, I think it was 92, 91. And then the bankrupt of the tequila crisis in 94. And from there, the current tenure of banks, of the current owners of the bank. That whole convoluted story led up to the very inefficient system that we have. By all means, the Mexican financial system is backwards by 5, 10 to 20 years compared to other countries in Latin America. In the case of credit card, or more than credit card, is financial inclusion, which is the basic bank account that some people and businesses have. The problem that we have, Mariana, is that in the entire world, and I don't want to get too into the nitty-gritty details, but in the entire world, or most of the world, you have a system. It works as following. You have Visa and MasterCard as the switches, or the ones that run the transactions. Right. Then you have the banks that have issuers, the ones that give you, Mariana, a card, and also those banks that give POSs to the merchants. Okay, and then you have, of course, merchants and consumers. That system has checks and balances, and there's competition. There's competition at the switch level between Visa and MasterCard. There's competition between the banks for more cards and more merchants. The merchants and the people, the customer, you and me, have different options to choose from. That system has its own problems, but it has worked. It has worked in many parts of the world, like the United States, like Brazil, the UK, and other parts. Now, when we go to Mexico, this system, these two switches are owned by the banks. Visa and MasterCard do not operate in Mexico. So we have locally owned switches, which are treated as cost centers by the banks. And then the banks are also the owners of the acquirers and the issuers. And they also dictate the rules of the entire system.
So no competition, basically.
If there's a soccer game, the banks would own the stadium, the ball, the teams,
and the referee.
And the referee and everything, literally. There's very little competition. So this is why they have become so profitable. And it's the classic oligopoly or monopolistic competition issue, that it underserves a market. It makes products very expensive. It heavily restricts the supply of cards, and the supply of POS terminals, or the supply of solutions more than cards for consumers, and the supply of solutions for merchants. I mean, and you can see it in the numbers. I mean, I'm not making this up. For example, there was a report by Visa that came out about 4 months ago. Guatemala just passed Mexico in terms of transactions per capita.
I saw that.
And it's a country that has 1/3 of the income. So the level of financial penetration that we have in the country is not on par with the level of development of the country. It's a massive disbalance. This is why you have a massive fintech ecosystem in the country, Mariana. Why? Because we are trying to address this problem, the problem for merchants and the problems for consumers. Okay? When I told you what their problems, that's where
so basically you're skipping the whole top layer and going directly.
You can't do that. It's very difficult to do that. There's no money that can do that. There's one little dirty secret in financial services, which is there's no winner takes all. There are very, very few markets, only China probably, where one company or two have taken it all, aside from state-dictated monopolies. Okay? It's not that you can just take the top layer off. What needs to happen, we need to have regulation, enforce regulation. Those switches are decoupled from the banks. The rules are decoupled from the banks. And a central regulator actually puts the rules and the switches compete, and the banks compete, and the fintechs compete. And then the system, if that happens, I've been very vocal about this, the country will be with 70, 80% penetration rates in less than 5-6 years. It will be super quick, but we haven't had the right regulation. COFECE, Mexico's antitrust authority, issued a report and a recommendation around this about a year ago. It took them like 5 years to investigate this. And there has been some steps now. Visa just bought Prosa, one of the switches is still to be approved. But still, we need to make changes to the rules. And in my opinion, we need to do what happened in the telecom sector. We need asymmetric regulation in favor of the smaller and new players, and that punishes the larger players, because there's no other way where we're going to have a level playing ground for all to compete. And most importantly, it's not for everywhere to compete, for people and merchants to have access to financial services. Because what happens right now, it's only the big guys and the rich people have access to this. You, Mariana, you're not the one that is going to benefit from the most from having a good e-commerce service. Mm-hmm. It's a poor person or a lower middle income mom, single, that has no time to go to the supermarket, and she can order the supermarket online and have goods delivered to her home. She's going to be, because you have more time, Mariana, because you have more time and you have a car and you can do it, okay? That's the problem.
The whole country would benefit.
And it's the same with merchants. The lower the income, the higher the cost they pay for these inefficiencies. Right. And in Mexico, the very large merchants are able to compete, are able to offer bad products, but at least they are able to offer financial products. And consumers, rich people like you, like me, have all these options. Lower middle income and below, which is, by the way, the vast majority of the country, they don't have options. And that's the problem with this. That's the problem with oligopolies. They extract the rent out of consumers and out of producers.
Why is it that financial inclusion remains such a significant challenge in Mexico, given all the advances that Mexico has made?
The banks have such a strong hold on this, Andrew. The solution is very simple, but is not easy to implement, which is usually the case, right?
Yeah.
The solution is very simple. They just need to break up this thing and make sure that the large banks cannot dictate the rules, and they have to take one or the other, either the acquiring side or the issuing side, issue fines when they actually go into monopolistic practices, which they do every day, and enforce the rules. And Mexico, Andrew, I learned this at PayPal. Mexico is not a badly regulated country. I mean, we could be better, but it's not a badly regulated country overall. I compare this with Brazil, for example. When we started opening up PayPal Brazil and PayPal Mexico, it was a lot easier to open PayPal Mexico. The problem we have in Mexico is an enforcement of the rules. We have very little enforcement. This is not the payment system only. This is across the economy and across the country. Mariana, you can attest to this. Yeah. The problem we have is an enforcement of the rules. The thing is, on this, the problem is very clear, and I think it should be very easy or relatively easy to enforce the rules and make sure that these changes actually get done in order to have a much better financial system.
I wanted to ask also, as the head of this company, what's your biggest challenge? Is it regulation? Is it capital or talent or something else?
The biggest challenge we have, Andrew, is what every other startup in the world has, which is talent. If you look at our balance sheet, okay, the company's balance sheet, and this is the case for most tech companies around the world, we have almost no assets, no fixed assets. Okay, it's super light. The vast majority of our assets that we can count on is our people, and they go out the door every day, and we hope they come back next day. And I think that's the biggest issue. How do you attract, number one? How do you retain, number two? How do you let go? And how do you promote? And that's, like I said, where I made the biggest mistakes in the early days of a company. That's what makes or breaks a company. The quality, the density of talent that you're able to attract and promote, and you have to let them go. And I think, for me at least, it has been the hardest part. And talking with other tech CEOs or entrepreneurs, this is also the hardest part for them.
Adolfo, when you started Clip, I imagine that all of your energy was focused in sort of developing the products, sort of getting to the customer. Today, 12 years after or into Clip, what is your number one job today?
Today, my job has changed substantially, Mariana. I have done every single job inside of Clip, except coding, okay? Right. Because I know how to code, but I'm really bad at it, so so I don't do it. But I've done everything else, from customer support to sales to everything else. Every single job in the company, I have done it. Today, I don't play chess, okay, but my son plays and he has taught me a little bit. Today, I'm like the queen. You know how the queen moves in chess? She can move anywhere she wants, however she wants. She's super free. That's my job right now, okay? I can move wherever I'm needed and wherever I think I can contribute the most. Right now, that specific is number one, it's around people. What I mentioned earlier, how do we retain, how do we promote best people in the company? That's number one. Number two, everything that has to do with relationship with investors. As you know, we are, as a tech ecosystem around the world, the last 2 years have been quite tough because of the increase in rates. So it's quite important to stay close to your current investor and prospective investor. So that's number two. And I think that's the job that only the CEO can do. That's number two. And the other one that I'm closely involved is on the product roadmap, on what we're going to develop and how we're going to develop in order for our merchants to be better served. So those are the main three things that I do. There are some other things that I do here and there, but that's my current focus.
I want to ask you about digital transactions. We've sort of talked about around this a little bit, but Brazil has had some success with millions of Brazilians using digital transactions to conduct business. Do you think Mexico is going to catch up anytime soon? And what needs to happen for Mexico to catch up?
Brazil has this wonderful payment system called Pix, right? Or a part of the payment system. There are two examples like this around the world. The first one was India with product called UPI, which was developed many, many years ago. And the other one is Pix, which is more recent Brazil. I'm going to talk about what made each one successful and what we're lacking in Mexico. So in the case of India, UPI is mounted on top of a thing called Aadhaar, which is the unique ID system that India has. Every single Indian citizen is registered by, I think it's the iris and fingerprints on a central database. So in order to open up an account, you can do it with your phone because they take a picture of your iris and they will know if Mariana, it's actually Mariana. It's a wonderful piece of technology they developed. And on top of that, they developed UPI, which allows people to send real-time payments from person to person and from person to merchant and from merchant to merchant. Those two things are a real piece of technology and of regulation. So that's the case of India. They push that. Everyone has to use it. The central bank, I think they subsidized the transactions for a while. They made a massive push for that. So that's one model. The other model is the Brazil model. Brazil, even before Pix, was an incredibly deeply penetrated country from a financial point of view, both at the consumer and at the merchant level. So this means a lot of people had cards and bank accounts, and a lot of merchants had POS terminals or digital terminals. Pix rides on top of that. Okay, Pix is a system that rides on top of that, where people that have a bank account can really send real-time payments. But this was a country that was already very used to making digital transactions. They don't have the unique ID like India. It's a different setup. In the case of Mexico, we don't have a national ID. And you know, Mariana, we have tried several times to do this. And I don't think Mexico, at least in the short term, is going to have a national ID system because it's a little bit like the US. You know how, Andrew, in the US, people don't like the government having all their information? Well, Mexico is very similar to that. Okay, so I don't think we're going to have a unique ID system.
You have to opt in here in the United States to give your iris or your fingerprint.
Exactly. And they have to erase the picture, you know, what they do in the airports. Americans are very resilient against that. And in the case of Mexico, for different reasons, it's the same thing. So I don't think we're going to go the India route, the Pix route, okay? Pix worked in Brazil because it was deeply financial penetrated. In Mexico, we're not deeply financial penetrated.
Right.
Until we are deeply financial penetrated, that model is not going to work either. So what we need to do is solve this conundrum that we have, this oligopoly that I just spoke about a few minutes ago. If we do that, then we can mount on top of that a good system like Pix. We have had some efforts by the central bank, CODI, which was poorly designed, and it was never going to work. We have a new version called Demo, which I don't think is going to work either because you don't have this thing that I'm mentioning, deep financial penetration in the country. You first need to have deep financial penetration, and then you mount one of the systems on top of that. Once we have that, it's going to work. Like it has worked all over the world. But you need to understand these basic two requirements that these two very successful examples had in order for have our own successful real-time payment system.
Adolfo, do you think that the U.S. government can or should do something as part of the North American financial system under USMCA to try to encourage Mexico to make these changes faster?
I think they should, Mariana, because this whole issue right now going on in the U.S., the discussion about the border, right?
Right.
And now the border has become not only a Mexico problem, but a regional problem, because it's not only Mexicans that are trying to come or cross to the
It's
US,
the Chinese, exactly.
it's the Chinese and the Cubans and the Venezuelans, and like it's like everyone, okay? But like all problems, you have to slice it in order to solve it. There's still a good chunk of people that are going to the US for the border that are from Mexico. And the reason why they leave, it's twofold. There's a demand in the US for those jobs. So I think there's a big hypocrisy on the US side saying, hey, I don't want you here, but yes, please come and pick up the fruit and serve my people in the restaurants. There's demand, and where there's demand, there's going to be supply. That's basic economics. So that's one. And the other one is they don't have the right opportunities at home. And that's our case. In the case of Mexico, the hypocrisy that we say, oh, Americans, you're treating Mexicans bad because they cross the border. Yeah, dude, fix
We
your
do
problem.
the same, yeah.
Exactly. Fix your problems at home, okay, and then complain. This particular point, financial inclusion, along with education and health, are the three main, and security, okay? But let's focus on the first three. The main issues why people historically have left for the United States, because they don't have enough, they don't have a bank account, they don't have a good job, they cannot save, they don't have a good education, or they don't have health. So it's a combination of all of this. We as a country, we need to solve those things in order for people to stay where they were born and where they want to stay, because this is the most important thing. People don't want to go to the US.
Nobody wants to leave their own country.
Nobody wants to. But if we don't offer the right opportunities, they're going to keep leaving. Financial inclusion is one of those. It's one of those. We can solve at least one that part, and this is an easy solve.
Yeah.
The security part, this is one I didn't include. Yeah. It's a much more complicated problem. Health is also a much more complicated problem because it's health, it's in education also. This is easy to solve. Mm-hmm. This is, like the Americans say, this is a low-hanging fruit. You introduce competition into the financial system, you introduce fair rules of the game, and in 5 years, the country will be 80% bankerized.
And we will allow people to develop their own patrimony here.
Yeah, to keep their money in Mexico and to build their wealth. It's super easy. And I do think the US government should really push more towards this because it will benefit all. It will benefit Mexican consumers. It will benefit Mexican merchants. It will benefit Mexico as a country because of revenue. And it will benefit the US. Everybody will win, okay, except the coyotes. We should do it. The US should push for more change and more competition, fair competition on this ecosystem that we have been talking about.
So Mexico has a thriving fintech ecosystem, for example. Are there any other emerging industries that really give you optimism?
We have a thriving ecosystem, Andrew, but it's not a mature ecosystem yet. Look at Brazil. How many Brazilian startups have gone public, both in Brazil and in the United States, that go after financial inclusion or payments solutions? There are many. We don't have a single one in Mexico. So it's still mature. It is growing, but it's not a mature industry yet. And I think it's the one that is the most advanced along with e-commerce. I think in e-commerce, we're going to see next 10 years in Mexico are going to be quite interesting because of the connection also with the US. ID systems are going to be also, meaning facial recognition on that. If you can do facial recognition in Mexico, because we don't have a single database, like I mentioned, like they have in India, you probably can do it anywhere in the world. The technology that is developed here can go to other countries and other markets. I think those probably are the biggest three that I see: financial services or fintech, e-commerce, and everything that has to do with ID verification or identity management on a consumer level are going to be particularly exciting over the next few years.
Adolfo, let me ask you maybe a little bit of a weird question, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You are definitely a living proof of what a great entrepreneur is, and you have succeeded not only for yourself and your own company, but you've created an entire ecosystem in Mexico. You were one of those pioneers. Has success changed you?
So, this is a very good question, Mariana. I don't know who said this. I think it was Michelle Obama, that power and money and success does not change you. I think it just reveals who you are.
Okay. Yes, that's a good one.
I think it was her.
Great quote.
Yeah.
And I think it's an amazing quote because I do think it definitely, at least in my case, it has revealed to me who I am. I like to say that the clip stages have been very different. The first stage was with the bravery that ignorance gives you. That's what I threw myself into the project. The second one was more about execution and growing up and realization. That, let's call it, the teenage years. And this last few years have been more about reflection and self-knowledge. It has changed me. I hope that for the good, but it has changed me in how I look at myself. Number one, how privileged I have been my entire life, Mariana. I think you and I come probably from similar backgrounds in Mexico, and how privileged I was, the home that I grew in and the education that I received, that has been profoundly changed with Clip, and also how I see the importance of people management. I remember my boss at PayPal, I was talking about a product and this and that. And he said, dude, the most important thing is people and how you manage people. And I said, this guy has no idea. He's clueless. Everything is about the product. And many, many years later, I know how right he was, because that has changed also profoundly how I see companies, how I see organizations, how I see governments. And at the end of the day, it's the people that you bring in on board is what is going to make or break things. Everything else comes secondary. But yes, it has changed me, Mariana. I hope for the good, but it has changed me profoundly.
What advice would you give to other aspiring entrepreneurs?
This is a very good question. I hear this from more mature people that have a little bit of experience in work, like have a little bit more a longer career. They say, well, I'm waiting for the time to go out. And I said, dude, there's no perfect time. If you wait for the perfect time, you're going to wait forever. So for when I started Clip, we had one kid already, Marina, our oldest daughter. My wife, Lola, was pregnant with our second kid. We had very little money because I had paid student debt from PayPal. We were living in the US back then. I was paying health insurance, or we were paying health insurance from our pocket, which was like $2,000 in rent. So, it was the worst time to start a company. Okay. And I started. I threw myself into it.
You could not think of a worse time, right?
There's no right time. Okay. But with that, it comes another recommendation, which it was what allowed me to do this, is that when people go to school, they usually, some of them not, but they get married, or they go live with someone. Maybe some people do masters or not, but whatever, they buy a home, and then they buy a nice car, and then the membership to a club or whatever. And then 3, 4, 5 years later, your monthly expenses are not going to allow you.
Right.
You're trapped. Okay. You're trapped by the system that allows you to, or that moves you to spend money on things that you don't need and you really don't want. So my advice is always the same: is keep your personal burn very low, very low. Learn to live with as little as possible. If you do well, which most likely you do well, it's going to overcompensate. Trust me. But that gives you a lot of freedom. At least in my case, it gave me a lot of freedom. Lola and I were living with very, very little money, and we could go from one thing to the other very easily. I think that's number one. So there's not right timing. Keep the burn very low. The other one is this story is about the founder or the founders that they leave school to start something, and there are dropouts. Those are usually outliers. And outliers, you have to take them out of samples because they are outliers. There are only a few of them. There's a very good study that MIT did a few years ago where they show the sweet spot for entrepreneurs where companies have had the highest returns, okay? Taking out the outliers, of course. And usually it's people that have about between 38 to 42 years old. They have experience in an industry, a few years of experience. So enough experience to think you can change things, not too much experience. So you become pretty ingrained into the system. You become like, things cannot change. These things are the way they are. Right. And usually those are the ones that are the most successful ones that have a little bit more experience on the industry. So what I tell them is go and work in an industry you like, whatever that industry is. All industries need disruption. All industries need technology. Go work in something in an industry that you feel passionate about it. You will find problems a lot. Every single industry has a lot of problems. Gain some experience, and from there you might be able to do something amazing. This is for advice for younger people also, people coming out of college or out of masters. I think that those would be the recommendations. And most importantly, Andrew, is just throw yourself into it. If you believe you have a good idea, you can do some cheap testing before you throw yourself. And if you see that it has legs, throw yourself. You're not going to regret it. I haven't known a single entrepreneur that has gone do something and went bust and went back to a corporate job who has regretted going and starting something. I haven't met a single one, because the experience you gain is invaluable, and you're going to use that later for sure.
Adolfo, unfortunately, we have come to the end of this episode, but I would love to continue having this conversation. I mean, we can go on and on and on. I haven't even started scratching the surface. Thank you so very much for what a wonderful conversation always invited to come back to It's More Than Grit and to CSIS.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Andrew. Super happy to be here. And again, I can come back as many times as you want.
We'll hold you to that.
Yeah, we
All
will.
right.